Trapped on the haunted cruise ship, a terrifying mystery unfolds. Hook, are you ready to uncover the terrifying secret of a cruise ship that never stops? What would you do if you boarded a luxury ship, only to find yourself trapped in an endless nightmare? The darkness is waiting, and it's more alive than you could ever imagine. Stay with us until the end to discover the shocking truth behind the cruise ship conundrum. You won't believe what happens next. The ship rocked gently in the vast ocean. A low hum echoed through the halls. A soft breeze brushed against the windows. Everything felt calm, but something was wrong. Maya stood on the balcony, staring into the dark void of the sea. The waves seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. The air felt colder than usual, sharp against her skin. The silence was unsettling. She turned back to the cabin, trying to shake off the feeling. The door clicked shut behind her. Inside, the lights flickered once, then settled. She glanced at her phone. No signal. The faint sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Maya stiffened. There was no one else on this deck. She walked slowly toward the corridor, straining to hear. The steps grew louder, closer. Her heart began to race. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. The hallway was empty, but the air felt thicker now, heavier. A chill crept up her spine. Then, the sound of a door slamming shut in the distance. Maya's pulse quickened. She moved toward the source. The ship creaked and groaned under her feet. Every step echoed too loudly in the empty hall. As she approached the end of the corridor, the door to the engine room was ajar. A dim light flickered inside. She hesitated. Something wasn't right. Maya's hand reached for the doorknob. The metal was cold, slick with moisture. She turned it. The door swung open with a soft screech. Inside, the room was empty, but something was wrong with the machines. The gauges were spinning wildly, the lights flickering. A deep, mechanical hum filled the space. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She stepped inside. The room felt alive, like it was pulsing. Her mind raced, but before she could turn around, the door slammed shut behind her. Darkness swallowed her whole. The humming grew louder, closer. Something was moving in the shadows. Maya's breath quickened. She backed away, but there was no way out. And then silence. A voice, low and guttural, whispered in the dark. "Welcome aboard." The voice echoed around her, reverberating through the thick, cold air. Maya froze. Her skin prickled. Her pulse thudded in her ears. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice shaking. No answer, just the deep hum of the machines. She strained her eyes, searching the shadows, but saw nothing. Then a soft scraping sound like nails on metal. Maya's breath hitched. The air felt heavier, suffocating. A shape moved in the darkness. It was just a shadow, but it was wrong. It didn't belong. Maya's heart raced as she backed into a wall. The scraping sound grew louder, more deliberate. Closer. She turned to the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged. She twisted the knob with all her strength, but the door remained firmly shut. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. The shadow shifted again, this time nearer. She could feel its presence. Something watching her. A cold draft brushed against her face. Then a whisper, soft but distinct, curling around her ear. "Don't try to escape." Maya spun, but no one was there. Only the machines, only the darkness. Her chest tightened. The humming was louder now, vibrating beneath her face. She could feel it deep in her bones. And then the lights went out completely. The hum, the rhythm, stopped. Suddenly, everything was still. Too still. Maya's breath came in shallow gasps. She couldn't see, couldn't move. The silence was deafening. Then, just as quickly as it had gone dark, the lights flickered back to life. But they were different. flickering dim. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker, and she saw it. A figure standing just beyond the machines. Tall, motionless. A figure made of shadows. Her blood ran cold. It took a slow, deliberate step toward her. She could hear its breathing now, heavy, ragged. "Why are you here?" Maya choked out. The figure did not respond. It just moved closer, closer, each step slower than the last. Maya's heart slammed against her chest. She had to get out, but the door was still locked, and the figure was closer now, closer, almost within reach, closer. Maya's breath caught in her throat. The figure was almost right in front of her now. She could see the hollow eyes, the vacant stare that seemed to pierce her soul. It reached out one long, skeletal hand. The air grew colder. She stumbled back, her hands trembling, trying to find a way out. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. The humming returned, louder this time, shaking the walls. The figure's lips parted, as though trying to speak, but no sound came. Then the lights flickered again, and in that moment, Maya saw something else. The room was no longer empty. Behind the figure in the far corner, shadows writhed and twisted, pulling in on themselves like something alive. It was impossible. A nightmare come to life. Maya's eyes widened in terror. She turned, desperate to find any escape, but the air was thick, oppressive. She tried the door once more, slamming her shoulder against it. Nothing. The figure moved closer still, its footsteps silent, yet undeniable. Maya's legs trembled, as though they were no longer her own. Her mind screamed for her to move, to run, to escape, but her body refused. A low growl, almost like a whisper, reverberated from the figure's chest. It echoed in the darkness. "You shouldn't be here." Maya's hands gripped the door's handle with all the strength she had left, but it was useless. The figure was right there, its face inches from hers, its cold breath brushing her skin. The air grew thick with the metallic scent of something unnatural. Suddenly, the walls began to pulse, slowly at first, then faster. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow, stretching like tendrils. The ship itself felt alive. The floor beneath her feet quaked. The room began to spin. Maya's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor. The figure loomed over her, its hollow gaze fixed on her face. Then it reached down. Its fingers, cold as ice, brushed her cheek. "Maya." Her name sounded like a distant whisper in the air. Before she could react, the room went dark again. The hum of the machines stopped, and the door, it creaked open. Maya's body screamed for her to run, but when she looked up, there was no one left in the room. Nothing. Just the deep, unnerving silence of the engine room. The air was still. Too still that Maya's breath came in jagged gasps. Her head spun, disoriented. What had just happened? She forced herself to stand, every muscle aching. The door was wide open now. An eerie quiet hung in the air. No hum of machinery, no footsteps, just the oppressive silence. She hesitated, looking around. The shadows still seemed to move at the edge of her vision, but there was no figure, no presence, only the lingering feeling of something wrong. She took a slow step toward the door. The cold metal handle felt strangely warm in her hand, as if it had been waiting for her. Her skin crawled. Maya stepped out into the hallway. The dim lights flickered above her, casting long, distorted shadows. The entire deck felt off, empty yet not. She could feel eyes on her, though she knew no one was there. Every creak of the ship made her jump. The hallway stretched on forever, as though the ship had become a maze. She quickened her pace, but the floor beneath her feet seemed to shift with each step, as though the ship itself was alive. Her heartbeat echoed in her chest. The sense of being followed grew stronger. She turned a corner, only to freeze. A door, just ahead, was ajar. She had not seen it before. It shouldn't have been open. Maya's hand trembled as she reached out. The cold, metal handle seemed to throb under her touch. When she pushed it open, the room inside was unlike any she had seen before. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols she couldn't understand. The air was thick with the smell of something rotten, something ancient. Her eyes caught something in the corner, a figure hunched and still. For a moment, she thought it was a person, but when the figure turned, it wasn't human. Its eyes were too wide, too empty. It stared at her with a vacant gaze, its face pale and twisted, its lips parted in a silent scream. Maya stumbled backward, her heart racing. The door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. She spun around, trying to find a way out, but the walls closed in on her. The air grew cold, too cold. Something was moving in the shadows, something that was waiting, something that had always been there. Maya's breath hitched as she pressed herself against the cold, damp wall. Her eyes darted around, searching for an escape. The air felt suffocating, heavy, as if the room itself was tightening around her. The figure in the corner, it was no longer still. It moved slowly, deliberately. Its limbs twisted unnaturally, jerking like a puppet on strings. Its face contorted in ways that were not human. Maya's heart pounded in her chest. She needed to get out. The door, it was locked. Her hands shook as she tried to pry it open, but it wouldn't budge. The figure took a step toward her. It was closer now, so much closer. Its eyes, those wide, empty eyes, stared into her soul. Her body trembled with fear, but she couldn't look away. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow thicker, darker. The figure's mouth opened wide. A hollow, guttural sound escaped, like the moan of something long buried. "Leave," it rasped. Maya's chest tightened. She wanted to run, but her legs felt like lead. The room seemed to warp around her, bending and twisting as though it were no longer a part of the ship. She glanced at the door again. It was still locked. But then, a whisper, soft, barely audible. "Help." Maya froze. She strained to listen, heart racing. "Help," the voice repeated, closer this time. She turned, searching the shadows for the source. It wasn't the figure. It was something else. A faint silhouette emerged from the darkness, just beyond the corner. A hand reached out, trembling, and for a moment, Maya thought it was another person. But the hand was wrong. Twisted. Too long. The fingers curled unnaturally, and the voice, still soft, still pleading, came from it. "Help me." Maya stumbled backward, her mind racing. She could feel something pulling at her, something deep within the walls, like it was trying to drag her into the shadows. A cold rush of air swept through the room, extinguishing the light. The darkness was absolute. The figure was gone. The door, the locked door, suddenly creaked open. The shadows pulled back. Just for a moment, Maya didn't hesitate. She ran, out of the room, down the hall, away from the voices, the whispers. The ship seemed to groan as if waking from a deep slumber. Each step she took, the floor seemed to tremble beneath her. Her breath came in desperate gasps as she turned corner after corner, her feet pounding the cold metal. But the whispers followed, distant, persistent, and the hum was growing louder again, closer. Maya's eyes scanned the empty hall, desperately searching for anything familiar. Nothing, only shadows. A sudden chill shot through her spine, and then she heard it, a voice, soft, not from behind her, but from ahead. "Welcome aboard." Maya's stomach dropped. The ship wasn't empty. It never had been. Maya stopped dead in her tracks. Her heart skipped a beat. The voice, it wasn't human. It was something else, something old, something lurking. The darkness stretched before her, like an endless void. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The words echoed in her mind. Welcome aboard. Her skin crawled. She turned around, but there was no one there. Nothing but shadows. The halls stretched on endlessly, twisting and bending in ways that didn't make sense. The floor seemed to pulse beneath her feet, the air thick, oppressive. Something was closing in on her, just out of sight. A presence, not a person, but something far darker. Her eyes darted back and forth, trying to catch any movement in the shadows. The humming grew louder, closer. It vibrated through the ship's walls, deep in her chest. The floor shifted beneath her feet, as if the ship itself was breathing. Her legs were unsteady, but she forced herself to move slowly, cautiously. She had to get out. She had to find someone. Anyone. The hallway twisted, looping back on itself. She'd been here before, but it wasn't the same. The walls seemed to bend, stretch. The lights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows. And then she saw it. A figure standing at the end of the hallway. Tall, cloaked in shadow, its face hidden, but Maya could feel it watching her, staring. The humming grew deafening, like a storm trapped inside the ship. Maya's breath came faster. She couldn't breathe. The air was thick, stifling. She had to move, but her legs were frozen. The figure moved, one slow step forward, then another. It didn't make a sound. No footsteps, no breathing, just that eerie, oppressive presence. "Please," Maya gasped, the words barely escaping her lips. She turned and ran blindly down the hall. Her footsteps echoed through the emptiness. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows pressing against her. The hum, it was everywhere now, vibrating through her very bones. She could hear it in her head, in her chest. "Help me." The whisper came from behind her. Too close. She turned her head. Nothing. But then, the sound of something dragging across the floor. Slow. Steady. Something was following her, and it was getting closer. The hallway seemed endless, the shadows closing in with each step. And then, the door to the deck appeared ahead. Her last hope. She rushed toward it, her hands reaching for the handle. But when she touched it, it was cold. Too cold. The handle twisted in her grip. A sound, an unnatural screech, filled the air. The door wouldn't open. And then, just as the shadows closed around her, the voice came again. "Welcome aboard." Maya's world went dark. Maya's heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow, ragged. She tugged at the door, desperate, but it refused to budge. The shadows were closing in, thickening, suffocating. The ship seemed to groan, as though it was alive and hungry. The hum vibrated through the walls, growing louder, more insistent. Her hands were slick with sweat as she twisted the cold metal handle again. Nothing. Then, something scraped against the floor behind her. Slow, measured. Maya's skin prickled, every hair on her body standing on end. She turned, her eyes wide, but she saw nothing. Nothing but darkness. The air grew colder. Her breath formed clouds in front of her face. A whisper just above her ear. "Run." Her heart skipped, but she didn't move. She couldn't. The shadows were all around her now, pressing in from every direction. It felt like the walls themselves were breathing, constricting. The whispers grew louder. "Leave or be lost." She glanced over her shoulder again, fear gripping her. Then a figure appeared, tall, shadowed, cloaked in darkness. It stood at the end of the hall, just watching her, frozen. Its presence was crushing. The floor beneath her feet vibrated as if something massive was moving, something vast and ancient. Maya couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure. Something was pulling at her, drawing her toward it, like gravity itself had changed. Another step. It took a slow, deliberate step forward. And then the door creaked open. Just a crack. A sliver of light. Maya's heart skipped again. She could escape. The figure's hollow, empty eyes locked onto hers, its face still hidden in the shadows. It was getting closer. The ship's groan intensified, and the shadows surged forward, rushing toward her. Everything in her screamed to run. Maya spun, hands outstretched, reaching for the opening door. Her fingers brushed the edge, and then the light went out. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The world was plunged back into darkness. Maya gasped, panic flooding her veins. She was trapped. The hum, now a deafening roar, echoed around her. And the whisper came again, this time louder, sharper. "Welcome to the crew." The walls shuddered. The air felt thick, thicker than before. Her breath caught in her throat. A sudden, icy coldness gripped her, creeping down her spine. The shadows twisted and writhed around her, as if alive. Something was changing, something ancient. And in the silence that followed, the ship groaned once more. Like a living thing, waking. Maya's chest constricted, her breath caught in the icy air. The walls trembled beneath her fingers, pulsing with an energy that felt alive. She couldn't think, couldn't move. The shadows, they were alive. They crawled along the floor, stretched across the walls, twisted up toward the ceiling, as though they were part of the ship itself. The hum had stopped. A deep silence enveloped the room, but it was not peaceful. It was suffocating, and then she felt it. A hand, cold, clammy fingers brushing against her wrist. She spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. Nothing but shadows. But the hand, it was still there, lingering in the cold air, grasping at her, pulling her down. A voice, soft and cold, whispered from the darkness, "Join us." The sound vibrated through her skull, resonating deep in her bones. The shadows tightened, wrapping around her, constricting, pulling her in. Her heart pounded wildly in her chest as she fought against the pressure, against the pull. She twisted and turned, trying to break free, but the air thickened around her, as if the very walls were closing in. Her vision blurred, and the shadows seemed to twist into grotesque shapes, faces distorted, eyes hollow. "Don't fight it." The voice was clear now, louder. It came from all around her, swirling through the darkness like a chant, a ritual. The coldness pressed harder against her skin, seeping into her very soul. The walls of the ship groaned once more. She gasped, the breath stolen from her lungs as the temperature dropped to unbearable lows. The shadows began to pull her forward, closer, closer to the center of the room, to the thing that waited. Maya's hands reached out, desperate to stop herself, to grab hold of anything. But there was nothing, just the darkness, the suffocating, oppressive darkness. And then she heard the sound of footsteps, slow, steady, not behind her, not in front, above her. She looked up, her neck straining, her eyes wide with terror. A figure hovered there, cloaked in shadow, staring down at her with a gaze so empty it made her bones ache. Its mouth opened, but the words it spoke were not human, not language at all. A guttural, growling noise rumbled from its throat, deep and unnatural. It reached down, its fingers stretching, impossibly long. It touched her face. The cold burned like ice. But it was not just the cold that seared her skin. It was the touch. It felt like death. Maya screamed, but her voice was swallowed up by the deep silence, swallowed by the very ship itself. The figure's grip tightened. The darkness closed in around her. And then, as if the world itself had fallen away, Maya vanished. The ship was silent once more, but the shadows, they remained. They watched, and waited. The silence lingered, thick and suffocating. For a moment, it seemed like nothing had changed. The shadows held their breath. The ship was still, but beneath that stillness, something stirred. A low, rumbling hum began to return, deep within the walls. Slow at first, like a heartbeat waking from slumber. And then it grew louder, more insistent. The shadows, which had once been motionless, now seemed to pulse with life. Maya was gone, but she wasn't the only one. The ship had claimed her, and it would claim more. The hallway was empty, yet there was a presence, an unspoken awareness, lingering in the air, in every corner. The lights flickered again, flickered, and then went out entirely. Darkness swept over the ship, blanketing everything. But the hum didn't stop. The engines still alive, still working, still pulling the ship through the endless black sea. The ship moved with purpose now, as if it was awake, aware of what it had become. And far below deck, in the deepest corners of the ship, the shadows thickened. They gathered. They whispered. There was a door no one had ever noticed before. It stood at the edge of the engine room, partially hidden behind pipes and rusted machinery. It creaked open slowly. A figure stepped through, emerging from the dark. It was tall, cloaked in shadows, but this one wasn't like the others. This one had a face, Maya's face. Her eyes were wide open, vacant. Her mouth moved, but no words came out. She didn't look alive, but she wasn't dead either. She stood still, silent, waiting. The door slammed shut behind her, and the shadows surged forward. Maya's body, her broken, twisted form, began to move, slowly jerking, as if still adjusting to its new existence. She turned. The shadows followed. They always did. Up above, on the deck, the wind howled. The ship moved faster, cutting through the sea with a renewed fury. No one else was aboard. No one alive, at least. Only the echoes of those who had been claimed. And the ship, it never stopped. It could never stop. Not now. Not ever. For the cruise ship's true journey had only just begun. It would continue to sail through the endless darkness, forever. And whoever came aboard next would be welcomed. Into the shadows, the ship cut through the dark waters, its hull slicing the ocean with a cold, unyielding force. No light flickered from the deck, no movement, only the deep, rhythmic hum of the engines. Inside, the ship was a labyrinth, a twisting maze of cold corridors, locked rooms, and forgotten places. Places that should never have been found. No one had come aboard for days, weeks, maybe longer. But there were whispers in the creaking of the walls, in the rattling of windows, whispers of those who had never left. The shadows had claimed them all, and now they waited. In the deepest corners of the ship, in the rooms no one dared enter, the walls seemed to breathe. A heavy, unnatural pulse echoed through the floors, and in the darkest recesses, something stirred. A figure appeared in the hallway, a new passenger. He stumbled, his footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. His eyes were wide with confusion, filled with the innocence of a tourist, a traveler. He had no idea what he had boarded. He walked slowly, his mind lost in thoughts of what awaited him at his destination. But as he turned the corner, he felt it. The sudden shift in the air. The temperature had dropped. The ship creaked. He froze. Something was watching him. He glanced over his shoulder. There was nothing. But the sensation, the pressure on his chest, grew heavier. He could feel it now. The eyes, the presence. A whisper. Soft, distant, welcome. His blood ran cold. He turned again, this time running toward the nearest exit. But the ship seemed endless. Every corridor led him back to the same place, back to the same door. The shadows seemed to stretch farther now, curling in on him, pulling him forward. The ship groaned again, its metallic voice filling the air. The humming grew louder, and then he saw it. A figure emerging from the darkness. Tall, cloaked. It stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, its eyes locked onto his. He stumbled backward, and then he heard a voice, his own voice, whispered, "Help me." It was too late. The ship had claimed him. The ship drifted through the endless night, the ocean stretching out in all directions, a void that seemed to consume everything. Above, the stars were obscured by thick clouds. The ship's lights flickered intermittently, casting long, distorted shadows across the deck. There was no one left alive aboard. The ship, once a vessel of leisure and luxury, had transformed. It had become something else, something ancient, hungry, and eternal. Deep below, in the heart of the ship, the echoes of those who had disappeared still lingered. Their whispers filled the hallways, their presence woven into the very fabric of the ship itself. Maya's face was no longer just a memory. It had become a part of the ship. Her hollow eyes, her twisted form, drifted silently in the corners of the ship's endless halls. She was the ship now, and the ship was her. The shadows, the darkness, they all belonged to it now. But the cycle wasn't over. It never would be. A new passenger would come, unaware of the fate that awaited them. They would board, curious, excited, and blissfully ignorant of the ship's true nature. And the ship would whisper. It would call to them, "Welcome aboard." The engines hummed, steady and relentless. It was a sound that would never fade. It was the heartbeat of the ship, and it would continue forever. The ocean, too, had become a part of this endless journey. It would stretch on, a vast black sea, with no shore in sight. The ship would never reach its destination, for there was no destination. Only the journey, only the passengers who would be lost, the shadows that waited, and the ones who would never leave. As the ship sailed deeper into the night, the stars faded entirely, swallowed by the endless black. And in that silence, in that eternal darkness, the ship continued on, its voyage never-ending, its hunger insatiable, always waiting for the next soul to board.